Thanks. Okay, this is Queen&Collins, and I wanted to just start by talking about how a project that was driven by a quest by GPT to reposition a retail and commercial asset, we turned into an urban design project and aligned that with some heritage moves as well. So in disaggregating some of the heritage buildings and reconnecting them to the city, we also managed to reprioritise one of the finest interiors of Melbourne, the Cathedral Room, always a place of commerce, reinstating it with that. And I wanted to just start with a little quote from Rossi, because I think this helps position this project. He talks about permanence being a past we're still experiencing, and says permanents present two aspects. They can be considered as propelling elements or as pathological ones, artefacts that enable us to understand the city in its totality, or artefacts that appear as a series of isolated elements that we can link only tenuously to an urban system. So for us, this project, about a quarter of a city block, was what extent of change was necessary, in part to some heritage buildings, for these valued permanences to be a propelling element rather than a pathology. So a bit of a mouthful to start the day with, but anyway, so the site was made up of the Queen Street Tower and then the three heritage buildings, as you can see there on the right-hand side. A quick walk around of how we found the site, fairly closed, and an interior that was very much about a sort of corporate lobby rather than an invitation for people to explore who were not part of the tower. The key things that we changed from a heritage point of view, you can see here the focus areas. First of all, the accessible ramp on 380 Collins Street entry. The next thing was introduction of an opening in the Cathedral Room. That was the most contentious with Heritage Victoria. Third was end of trip in that space underneath the Cathedral Room. Fourth was a change to the entrance hall of 380 Collins Street as well for that lobby, and again, access and lift requirements, and no changes to the banking chamber. So the Cathedral Room, always a place of commerce, the original stock exchange. So some of the things we took away from the early 90s work was just these atrium elements and opening the site back up to the open air. Some of the themes that we played with was reinstating and amplifying the variations between the heritage buildings, as well as some of the new buildings introduced, and really lane, not lobby, and celebrating this Gothic beginnings. The existing figure ground when we started was this kind of smeared corporate lobby through the spaces. So the middle diagram shows how we disaggregated and reinstated the sort of individual footprints, if you like, by creating this interstitial network of lanes open to this air. And last of all, this idea of each building having its own character celebrated. So laneway, not lobby, civic doors opening to the city, and a much more reiterated street address. Wellness and connection to environment as well, very timely with COVID, and upgrade of lobbies and amenities. Idea of urban furniture introduced throughout the more public realm parts of the spaces. So what we have is a variety of architectures, these juxtaposed with these spaces in between, many levels which we've been able to retain, but also address access requirements, and open to the sky and to the city. Magnificent Cathedral Room. You can see from these sections this incredible variation in height, proportion and scale. And then you can see below the Cathedral Room where we put the end of trip space. Ground floor plan, very intense. So some diagrams to help the main part of our work. This public realm throughout, and this, as I say, disaggregation for the heritage buildings, opening up the courtyards again to outside. Little example of the pathways through the site now possible, while also maintaining the three individual addresses, Queen Street, Little Collins and 380 Collins as well. We've also created a new one on Briscoe Lane, which was where a loading dock was before, and that relates to the Cathedral Room works. So for a walk around the corner, the southwest corner, Wardell's very fine ANZ Bank, 380 Collins Street, this is where we introduced the ramp to the front for access. Changes on Queen Street really was removing that glass roof so that that sort of break between is again a laneway. The civic doors introduced in the 1990s building. and a sort of larger retail frontage. This interior of intrigue, we took a lot of our cues from Venice, the pink lanterns, so you can see that there's a bridging of these new works with the introduction of Gothic architecture into Melbourne in some of the detailing. So it's very much a conversation between the heritage and the new works. Opening out to this middle Campiello. Campiello is a French term for small squares in Venice. So you can see this interplay between new and heritage buildings. Some of the heritage buildings, on the backs of them, when we removed the glass ceiling, did mean that we had to refinish those external walls because they had been stripped in the 90s and were no longer weatherproof. So just taking you through this journey of intrigue, it's really trying to have a sense of curiosity, discovery in the way in which it's organised. And then this southern Campiello, where we begin to reveal the cathedral room through to 380 Collins Street, where we introduced a lift and stairs. So in the cathedral room, this magnificent space I'm sure you're all familiar with, it was a very sort of, sadly, it's always been publicly accessible technically, but really there was no reason to use it. So we did introduce this opening on the northern end of it, which leads out to this newly created courtyard, another way of getting light and air, and also a further entry and exit point on the site, so connecting it to the city. This was what was so contentious, but we think it really unlocked the urban potential of the site. And I should note too, this is has been leased to a food and beverage outlet, so it is going to be used for a restaurant. We think that's an appropriate use, and I think the thing we had discussions with Heritage Victoria about was that it was a stock exchange, it was a trading hall, it was full of life, it was a noisy, robust, commercially driven space, so entirely appropriate that that should happen. So the end of trip, the end of trip is underneath the restored glass floor, which you saw in the cathedral room. And I think to finish up, I just want to sort of finish by just posing the question that it is a project, I think, that does ask us to balance keeping things in their entirety as an artefact, which is potentially at the expense of integrating them back into the city and being part of urban flow, which was certainly the case with the cathedral room. I cannot wait to see it properly occupied in a post-COVID or more COVID-relaxed context. Thank you.
We're in Q&A session now, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Kirsten, great project. Thanks for showing that. It seems that disaggregation was really the fundamental sort of part of the